Welcome to the Grower Coach Garden Show with garden expert Ken Salvail. Email your questions to ken@growercoach.com. Now, here's your garden coach, Ken Salvail.
Roots will start to breathe oxygen immediately. It's the only gas they need. They don't need the carbon dioxide like the rest of the plant does. Roots will absorb the carbohydrates, the sugars that are made by the leaves, and when the roots absorb those carbs, they have to be able to break them down. So they have to have oxidation. So they need oxygen in order to respirate. And so that's how the roots stay alive. So I know a lot of us have drowned plants before, maybe the irrigation has flooded something and the plant has died. And the reason for that? No oxygen. The air is gone. So the roots can't breathe, the plant can't live. But isn't it interesting? I find it interesting that 50% of your soil mass is either water or air. And just, I always think of that whenever I'm planting a tree or a plant, that I have to get in and break that soil up and allow the oxygen to enter into it. Sometimes I'll plant a big tree or something and I dig the hole out and it's just like chiseling rock sometimes. It's like, oh my God, I can't leave it like this. So then, I used to do it more with a pick. Now I do it with a young fella. I tell him, come over here and swing that pick as hard as you can into the sides. And we call it cracking the soil. So we crack the soil all the way around that hole, and we allow those cracks to let the oxygen in so that the roots can breathe and be able to penetrate into that soil. Gives them a good head start. So, plants don't really like that compacted soil situation. And one of the things we can do to help to prevent compaction is add organic matter. And again, this 5% is perfect. The Okanagan here, we have less than 1% in our soils here. So it's sand, silt, and clay. It's predominantly silt. We have more silt than just about anything, unless you're in Glenmore and you have clay. But we have a very small amount of organic matter. So when you look at each individual particle, they call this a soil texture. The soil texture is actually those mineral particles, the sand, the silt, and the clay. And the sand particles would be considered fairly large. This shows gravel, which could be anything that's sort of bigger than probably a 1/16 of an inch or an 1/8 of an inch would be considered gravel. And sand would be the finer stuff, which we all know what sand is. But silt is interesting because that's really the thing that you see that blows around in the wind. When you get dusty days in the summertime, that dust is usually silt. And silt is very tiny. It's very hard to see a grain of silt. You often see little clusters of it. But clay, on the other hand, is absolutely invisible. It's so tiny that you can't see it with the naked eye, a little piece of clay. It needs to be observed with an electron microscope, so it's extremely tiny. And so what we have here is we can see those size differences, and definitely the clay is invisible on this scale for sure. So again, sand, pretty straightforward. Silt is that dusty stuff that you'll find, and often when you're here in the Okanagan, the sunny Okanagan, it is often what you get when you order topsoil. Is you get a big load of silt. So it's not always that great to just get one thing. And of course, clay, we know we make pots out of it, right? So clay is interesting, out of the three categories there, sand, silt, and clay actually holds more nutrients than just about any of the other minerals, because the particles are so tiny that they actually cling on and hold on to the nutrients. And so all clays are rich in nutrient. And I can always remember a containered plant that one day we used to pot thousands and thousands of pots of plants every day back in the old days. And we would pot so many up, we were doing them at high speed. And I remember afterwards planting up some of these pots and dumping them out, and then seeing that one or two of the pots had a clump of clay in it. And it was heavy and hard as a rock, it seemed like, but it was just heavy, no oxygen in it. But man, did the roots grow into that blob of clay. It was like the plant that was growing in the pot grew all of its roots into the blob of clay, like it was just candy to that plant. So it was a good situation though, because all the potting soil had lots of oxygen in it, so it allowed the roots to live and grow, and then they grew into that ball of clay and really took advantage of all that beautiful nutrient. So what about organic matter? This is what we're talking about today, is compost. And so now we know we have the sand, the silt, and the clay. And we know that clay is really good. It's very tiny, but it's full of nutrients. Well, where does organic matter come into the picture? And organic matter is literally any of the green or living materials. I suppose it could be even animals for that matter, but any living materials, particularly plants that are breaking down and decomposing, turn into this beautiful product called humus. And humus develops a product called humic acid, which is really the secret to plant life ultimately, and plant nutrients. So when you see, the leaves on the ground, you'll see there's a green leaf in here. This year we're going to see a lot of green leaves, right? Because of this hard frost we had. And the crazy trees are not dropping their leaves. So we're going to see damage occur. We're going to see another snowfall. We're going to see more broken branches, unfortunately. So we'll end up with more curly willow, unfortunately. Or fortunately, we can get some more plants. But the ultimate thing is the leaves are going to be different this year because the leaves are green. So any foliage that's green has nitrogen in it, right? And nitrogen is what makes compost happy. That's what makes what we call active composting happen. Bacteria love to eat nitrogen, and green leaves are nitrogen rich. So it's going to be a pretty interesting thing to gather those leaves this year that are normally just carbon, and this year we're going to be able to take advantage of it, and we're going to get a little bit of nitrogen out of the deal as well. So I'm kind of looking forward to that. Here we go, just a quick note on sort of how to tell what you have. So if you have a garden and you want to find out, what do I have for soil in my garden? What is my texture? The texture is the sand, silt, and clay. And so basically you just take a jar like this, you take a sample of soil that's generally a mixture of about 4 or 5 locations blended together and put into a jar, about half full, or maybe a little more than half full, but about half full. And then you top it up with some water. Some people like to put just a little pinch of dishwasher soap in it, because that doesn't foam. It's got anti-foaming agent in it. So it just has a little soapy effect. And then you shake it and shake it and shake it. Always put the lid on first. I learned that the hard way. But you put the lid on and you shake it and shake it, shake it. And it breaks up all the particles. And you just keep shaking. It takes about maybe 10 minutes or so of solid shaking, and it breaks all the little particles down. And then when the particles all separate, you just basically take that jar and sit it on the shelf, and then don't move it. Just set it there and let it sit and walk away. And it's going to tell you a couple things. You can see up in the top, I'm not sure how well you can see that, but at the very top you'll see a very fine layer. Actually, this colored drawing here might be easier to see, but the colored drawing is showing the white layer. You see the water, and then the white layer, which is clay. And in the actual picture, it shows a very thin layer of clay. And then it shows another layer, a brownish layer that looks quite fine, and that looks like the silt layer. And then as you go down a bit farther, it would be sand, and then down on the very bottom is the gravels. And so this will always settle out this way every single time, because they always settle based on the speed at which it takes for them to fall out of the water. So it says here on the right, it says sand layers take about 1 minute, and they're all settled out of your mix. The silt takes about 2 hours, and the clay, they just say when the water clears. And the reason is the clay particles are so tiny that they'll just float suspended in that water for sometimes days and days and days, and sometimes even over a week or even more. And so you just be patient and wait it out, and then that lets again, those particles are so tiny they almost dissolve in the water, but they eventually do settle, and then you end up with your layer of clay. The picture on the left is actually quite conducive to the Okanagan. We would see typically a small layer of sand, a big layer of silt, and then a very tiny layer of clay. And that would be just your typical soil that you might purchase, let's say, maybe at a garden center or from a soil supplier. The ratios of these are something that we talk more about in our soils classes, and I will be having some Zoom seminars on soils, which we'll get into a little bit more detail on that. But the key part of this is that it's just sort of understanding what's made up of the soil itself, and this whole thing about oxygen is key. So available water is water that the plants can absorb, and this is one way you can tell is if you ever take a handful of soil in your hand and it feels nice and moist, you know, it feels moist to the touch. So you think, oh, that's pretty moist, you know. So you squeeze it as hard as you can and squeeze and squeeze and squeeze, and you get this little droplet of water that comes out of your hand. That little droplet of water is the water that the plants use. So in other words, if you can't squeeze water out of soil, there is no water there for plants. So that's really important. I've heard lots of times people have plants that fail and they say, gee, well, it feels moist, you know. I always say, well, grab a handful of soil and squeeze it. You know, if you can get water out of it, then it's got water. But if you can't see water dripping, there's no water there for plants. So this is just a real quick picture here showing available water. So when you water a plant that's in a pot, let's say, you fill that plant up so that it's absolutely saturated with water and it actually starts running out the bottom. That fools you sometimes because the pots are sometimes dry and they're just not absorbing it. So you sometimes almost have to submerge it, you know, in a bucket of water or something to get the water to absorb. But once you hit full saturation, then you take it out and you set it, maybe if you're in the house, you set it on the sink and you let it trickle down the drain a bit. And then when it stops dripping, that's called field capacity. That's when your soil is at field capacity. It's the most water it can hold without it actually dripping away. And then, of course, on the other end of the scale is the wilting point, which is where the plant absorbs the water out of the soil. It absorbs it, and the water evaporates out of the leaves, so it removes the water from the soil. And then at some point, even if it feels moist to the touch, you'll hit a point where the plant will start to wilt, where it's no longer able to uptake water. And then certain species of plants, we were talking just briefly about drought-tolerant plants earlier, but drought-tolerant plants have learned to adapt to those conditions. And when they get really dry like that, they're okay with it. You know, they just shut down, they don't let any more water out, and they just sit waiting. They just wait for the water to come back. So it's one of these things that is just a really good understanding. But now let's get to the good stuff, right? So the good stuff is the compost. The compost is the key item. So you assume that all soils are sand, silt, and clay in some ratio. That would be the texture of the soil. And then the compost that we add in different percentages depending on the types of plants we grow. If we're growing these drought-tolerant plants here from the Okanagan, well, if they're native here, we know what they want, you know, less than 1%. They don't need a lot of organic matter. A small amount is good. I would say I might mix in about a 1% mixture or maybe 2% just to give them just to spoil them a little bit, maybe hold a little more moisture. But I would always add a beautiful layer of compost mulch on the surface to hold moisture in. Now, you know, what is composting? And of course, that is the breakdown of the different types of material by different organisms. And we'll talk about that here today. We're also going to talk about types of composting and why we compost and compost recipes, the benefits of plant compost and personal benefits, of course, and how to get started and finished product. And so we'll just get right on with it. So composting is the natural breakdown or decomposition of organic materials, and it's fully natural process that occurs in all environments. And from this compost, we typically do get a beautiful, sweet, musty smell. I really like it. I know that when compost goes through certain stages of composting, we get a real strong, stinky smell, depending on how much green material we have in there. Because remember I was saying right off the top that nitrogen is the key to getting that compost hot. And the more nitrogen you have in there, the more smell you're going to get. But it only lasts for about a day or two, and then it's gone, and you go right back to your nice sweet smell. Sweet, sort of. So the composting occurs when small organisms use organic material as a food source. So these small organisms can be things like literally bacteria, which is what we commonly use for the faster forms of composting. Sometimes it's an organism like fungus, which we'll use for slower systems of composting. And basically a lot of little insects that go in and chew stuff up and make it smaller, make it more edible for these other organisms. So as these microbes consume the organic material, they create humus and heat as the byproducts. So you know that composts get hot, of course, and if anybody's ever mowed a lawn, you'll know how fast the bacteria attack that grass. As soon as you cut the grass, the bacteria wants in on it. They're on it. And the bacteria moves in and it just starts to consume it at a super fast rate. And I mean, you can put a pile of lawn clippings down and come back 5 minutes later and it's already almost too hot to put your hand in. So that's how fast the bacteria attack that. That's their favorite food, of course, because they are what you eat. Lawns are high nitrogen feeders. They are high nitrogen. So if you want to break down your old leaves from winter, well, you have to use some lawn clippings. So that works really well. We'll talk about carbon-nitrogen ratio here shortly. So basically, you know, it is nature's way of recycling. And I always tell the story of my system that I used to use for composting, which some people use a bin system of some sort. I had a 9-bin composting system, and it was just because I had so much compost and it was coming in on a daily basis. So because I would have like a truckload of beautiful like hosta leaves and beautiful composted, just beautiful stuff for composting, grasses, all kinds of things, and every day loads and loads and loads of it. So I was just like, I was in heaven. I thought, wow, this is gonna be awesome. So I'd bring in all this beautiful compost and I'd put it in bin number 1, and the pile would be huge, and that thing would start to stink like you wouldn't believe because of all the green, you know, all that high nitrogen foliage in there. So the whole thing would just start to get super, super hot. And then, of course, the next day, another truckload of the stuff would come in. So I'd right away take the bin number 1 and put it into bin number 2, and then take the new stuff and put it back into bin number 1. Of course, these are big bins, probably as wide as this screen is. And then from bin number 2, next day, here comes another big load again. So I put bin number 2 and bin number 3 and bin number 1, 2, and then fill number 1 again. And I just kept up with this. I needed 9 bins because by the time I get to the end, it was unbelievable. I had almost nothing left. You know, it's just an amazing thing at how compost breaks down. And the more you keep turning it and turning it and turning it and turning it, like I was doing, the less product I end up with at the end. Like I should have stopped. I didn't realize it, but I just had more stuff coming. So I just kept turning it and turning it and turning it. And I did that for the whole season. And by the end of the year in bin number 9, I only had about 3 or 4 wheelbarrow loads left for my garden. It all just disintegrated. I couldn't believe it. I was just so disappointed. But I was putting in so much of this nitrogen-rich, beautiful foliage, like big leaves of hostas, because we're a gardening company, so we brought in a lot of gardening stuff. And it was really good compost, but there wasn't very much because my garden was 30 by 25, so it wasn't as good as I thought it was going to be. So I ended up bringing in more compost. So I guess I should have stopped halfway along. But basically, why we compost is really to reduce the landfill, you know, don't overfill the landfill, because they don't have that ability to keep turning it. Like they'll put this, they have a landfill section for composting. So they take all the compostable stuff, they shred it up really good and crush it, and then they turn it and they pile it in windrows. And then of course they'll even pump air into it to speed up, to get more oxygen in there. Because if you have lots of nitrogen and lots of oxygen, you get lots of composting going on. So they build the compost to a certain point, and then they shut it down and they stop moving it and stop turning it. And that's what keeps it bulky. If they just kept turning it and turning it and turning it, they'd end up with nothing. It would just be all gone. So it's a pretty interesting process, I find. So the common recipes that you hear about are the active, so active composting, and that's where we're using carbon, nitrogen, water, and oxygen all mixed together. And we're obviously just continuously stirring and moving, and we're using predominantly bacteria to break that compost down, and that's where that heat comes from. So we churn it and churn it, and we keep oxygenating it, and we keep needing more nitrogen. So we have to keep turning it. When you have a pile that just sits and sits and sits, you're not really doing the active composting thing, because you're not getting enough oxygen in it. You have to check for moisture level. It's got to have about 30% to even 50% moisture level is about right. But this carbon-nitrogen ratio is something that's pretty interesting. And I know as gardeners, hopefully you find it interesting, but it's a 30-to-1 ratio. So that means you need 1 part green to up to 30 parts brown. So 1 part nitrogen to 30 parts of carbon. So with all these leaves that normally fall, and usually they fall and they're brown or yellow or red or whatever, but they've lost the green, which is the nitrogen, right? So normally when our leaves fall, we put them in a big pile and we let them sit, and they slowly break down. But if we want to break those down with bacteria, we have to add lots of lawn clippings or green to it. But what's going to happen this year? That's my question. I'm kind of excited about it because everything's an experiment, and I'm really looking forward to taking some of these dead green leaves and putting them into the compost.
Does shredding help them?
Absolutely, yeah. Shredding speeds everything up. And with leaves, my favorite thing with leaves was just piling it on the surface of the ground, especially like in the vegetable garden, and the worms come up from underneath and they eat those leaves. Like they just love them. And so that was really a nice little touch. But just think about that 30-to-1 ratio for now. That's a key. That's your carbon-nitrogen ratio. I can remember years ago, you know, they would say 25-to-1. And I think more recent information is 30-to-1, which is a nice ratio. And so you're predominantly using bacteria and oxygen to make that get hot. And as you turn it, it gets hotter. And like I was doing with my pile every day, moving it, oh my God, that just disappeared. And I don't really recommend it because you don't end up with enough to use. But the compost recipe number 2 is really passive. This is passive composting. So this is the stuff where I think a lot of people have passive composting, where you just throw it in a pile and you're done. You know, you make your pile and that's it. There's your pile. So normally you can see the brown leaves, and that would be normal. This year they're probably going to be green. Like I say, what's going to happen? And then it sits and sits and sits, sometimes up to a year without much movement, as long as it gets a little bit of moisture. In climates where it rains, the leaf mold works much faster. It seems to break down much quicker. But here we don't typically get enough moisture, and the leaf mold, the leaf composting process is very, very slow. It's often a year. What I do is I get a small amount of leaves, so that would be about, say, 10 garbage cans full. So I have these tall plastic garbage cans, and I put all my leaves into there, and I'm saving them. And I also know I'm going to try to create this damp, moist, low air circulation environment. So I fill the can right up to the top. I wet it down or just leave it open at this time of year when it rains. You know, it gets nice and moist. Then I put the lid back on, and that's it. And I let that sit through the winter. And then by spring, I open it up again. It gets a little bit of oxygen in there. Not really necessary for the fungus. And I'll often see mold growing on there, just like the term leaf mold. And this is what I'm actually creating, is leaf mold. And you can see in the picture over here is the actual leaf mold itself. So leaf mold is one of the most beautiful gardening products. It's just that it goes through a phase when it converts from carbon back over to where it's feeding nitrogen and other nutrients. And as soon as it hits this point here where it still looks like leaves, but it's turned black or dark brown, that's where you're hitting the sweet spot, and that's a beautiful thing. So active composting, turning and oxygenating and adding green, you know, some people cheat and they get a bag of nitrogen and they sprinkle it in there, and it works. I mean, the compost just goes so fast, and they turn it and oxygenate it. But the passive way is where you put it in a pile and you just let it sit. And that's it. And I will often, like I say, I like to turn it over once about midwinter, just because in the Okanagan it tends to dry out on the top. So I like to get it down on the bottom. And again, the worms come up in there and just feast on those beautiful leaves. And so what you end up with is this beautiful structure and texture. So the texture is the sand, silt, and clay part. But the particles, sometimes they don't stick together very well. And so what we do is we use the compost as the sticking agent. And some people actually think it's actually is the stickiness of it because it's gooey compost, but it's not actually. It's actually an electronic charge. So the particles of the compost are very tiny, just like those clay particles we talked about earlier. So the clay particles are negatively charged. Anytime they come in touch with a positively charged ion, they grab on and they stick together. So positives and negatives attract. Same with compost. Compost is beautifully negatively charged, and it reaches out and it keeps grabbing on to nutrients. Well, in the Okanagan, what's our most two plentiful nutrients? We have more than anything else. It's calcium and magnesium. Both of those, both calcium and magnesium have two positive. They're a double positive ion, so they have like two positive connection points. So when you add them with anything negative like compost or clay, they actually grab on and they glue themselves together. So the gluing part, which causes these things to blend together and glue together, that is an electrical charge. It's positives and negatives. And so I just want to just skip ahead here a little bit. So when you see those little blobs and balls in the soil, that's called friable soil. When they're small, like in this particular picture, they're small and they're like little beads. That's what you're looking for, right? That's the goal. In order to get that, you need sand, silt, and clay, and you need some compost in there. And the compost acts as that magnet that glues everything together. And so just going back to this soil structure, so structure is how it's built. You know, you think like the structure like a house. So you take your texture, which is sand, silt, and clay, and you make, what structure is it? Like, how does it fit together? And this shows these different types of aggregate clumps of soil particles. They're held together by moist clay, organic matter, and by organic compounds. These things act like a positive, negative charge, sticking them together like glue, and they form all these different shapes that are common in soil situations. And not really information you really need to know, but this is the stuff that's good. So when you take these beautiful this beautiful friable soil, and you start to get them to mass together, they're called PEDs. And a PED is a big blob of soil. And these big blobs of soil are just the most beautiful thing. You know what's in this blob of soil, and when we just think back to those earlier slides, it's full of big air particles, big air holes, big spaces. You know, the worms get into these things and tunnel through them, and they make air tubes where the roots can get oxygen from. And so PEDs are actually really all these different shapes we just saw. So some of them are flat and some of them are small and round and beads, and these are the big PEDs, and that's what the farmer's looking for. So it's really the ideal thing. So how do we destroy all these beautiful PEDs that we build? Well, there's one easy way to destroy them all, and that's to rototill. It just smashes all this work we put into adding our compost and making the soil beautiful, so we get all these really nice little pores and spaces for the roots to grow, and the worms love it. And then we pulverize it, because humans like pulverized soil. But plants don't. Plants prefer, the longer you leave soil alone, the better it forms its own little balls, and it takes time to form these PEDs and things. It's not something that happens overnight. It can take 6 months or a year or 2 years, and I think over time it gets better and better. So I really like to just let it be. And in my vegetable garden, I kind of just fluff it lightly, and I mix in my compost and put my leaf mold on the surface, and add some compost. Worm castings are beautiful, but I just like feeding those worms, and they come up and they form little air passageways that go way down deep, and how does the earth breathe? Wormholes. Worms are the best thing for getting oxygen into the earth. Okay, so humic acid. What is humic acid? Plants love it. Composting makes humus, which humus makes humic acid, or is humic acid. The humic acid dissolves and coats nutrients, making them easy to absorb into the roots and cells. And so what this is think of acid just for what it is. We know things that are acidic dissolve things, right? And so we know that a lot of these minerals that we were just looking at, we were looking at different types of minerals, or at least a sand, silt, and clay. And some of those are minerals that plants use, like maybe calcium, magnesium. A lot of those micronutrients are actually minerals. But plants cannot absorb rocks. That we know. We know that a root cannot absorb a chunk of rock, even if it's tiny, even if it's microscopic, like the little bits of clay. But what they can absorb is they can absorb nutrients that are coated in this beautiful organic acid. So the organic acids itself, humic acid, it's full of nutrients. It's got all kinds of nutrients in it. But when it comes in contact with other nutrients, it coats those too. So it's a beautiful thing when you can get this nicely coated nutrient situation, where you can envision the little nutrients, how very tiny they are, and they are coated with this slippery substance, which is acid. The acid allows it to slip right into the root, and it's so easily absorbed by the plant. So this is the secret. We all know, oh yeah, compost is great, plants love it, right? Well, why? It's because of this. This is the key secret thing. So with humic acid, we know that it's one of these things that coats the nutrients, makes them easier to absorb by the plants, and plants just love it. It is acidic. So again, when you think of things that are rocks, like say calcium, magnesium, different nutrients, even molybdenum, and different micronutrients, they're rocks. So what happens when you put them in acid? They become liquid. They get dissolved into the liquid. So the plants can also absorb them easier. So acidity is a friend of the plants. I know sometimes we hear, oh, don't plant those plants there. There's pine needles there. It's making it too acidic. It's like, oh no, we love that acidity. We want lots of it. And in the Okanagan, the entire earth is as deep as you can imagine, is just solid calcium, which is the sort of the opposite of acidic. And so when you have all these pine needles piled there, it only goes about a ½ inch deep, so it really doesn't do anything. But man, that upper ½ inch is good. It's really good. Plants love it. So the other benefits, of course, humus makes an excellent soil amendment, and it loosens up clay and compacted soils, which I know a lot of you have thought of and have done before. We can get compost readily available here. So these particles, again, the humus actually glues those particles together because it also has an electrical charge. So if I had say this whole floor here was hard compacted earth, I could potentially, if I wanted to, drill holes in it all the way around and I've done this before, so actually drill holes with a drill to about 8 or 10 inches deep, and then pour in some beautiful organic compost into those holes, or put some nice top dress of compost. And then that earth, over a period of the next year or two, will all the particles will start to glue together, and they'll start to breathe again, and you'll improve the drainage. So it increases moisture retention in sandy and porous soils. In water deficient valley like our own, it's a really good thing, because compost of any kind really helps to hold moisture in the soil as well. And when it acts as a surface mulch, it's even better, so it's really great. And so with that in mind, from the composting end, we just move straight into the wilderness. Like what happens out in the bush? Well, all the plants come from the bush. That's where they all originated, right? Before we took them and put them in a greenhouse, they all originated somewhere out in the wilderness. Well, the thing is that the plants that like a fair bit of compost in their soil, they come from forests where there's a lot of leaves and a lot of, compost on the ground. And plants that come from deserts, like here, less than 1% organic matter, they don't really need the compost. But there's some advantages to putting beautiful compost on the surface. I just feel anytime you use compost, you're doing a good thing, right? We're lucky here, we can actually purchase compost in large amounts. It's easy to get. But the real forest litter, this is what happens in every situation around pretty much every plant that there is out there, is that the leaves drop and they compost over time. And then more leaves drop and they compost, and then grasses underneath die, and little plants die, herbaceous plants die, and they form this little layer. And if anybody ever goes for a drive out in the bush, you just go for a drive out anywhere up McCullough Road or anything, and you see where they cut the road along, and then you look up the bank, and it's just a gravel embankment, and then you'll see this tiny little layer sitting on the top, and that's your compost. That's the living part of the earth. And then when you see that, you're driving along, and I can hardly stay on the road half the time because I'm always looking at the side of the road. But sometimes you'll see soil and you go, oh, this is pretty good. It's kind of silty here, and then other areas it's just rock. And then the very top, you just get this little skiff of composty stuff on the top. Well, it's that surface that's the most important part of the recipe. It doesn't matter as much about what's underneath as it does about what's on the surface, because it's that surface stuff that nature naturally provides. It's the surface stuff that keeps everything alive. And now they've identified a lot of these fungus, the beneficial fungus like mycorrhizae that feed plants, and they are beneficial to a lot of plants. They originate in this surface mulch. So they're almost feeling like really, plant enthusiasts understand that relationship, that plants need compost, and they need it on the surface more than they need it underneath. Some vegetables like really high percentages, you can dig it in nice and deep, you can grow them in straight compost and they just love it. But not so much for the terrestrial, say, woody plants. They live in these conditions like out in the bush where you get this thin layer of some topsoil and then kind of not so good underneath. So with mulches, I think they're great if you can get a nice composted mulch. In this picture, just shows this beautiful black compost here, and the plants are all happy and doing their thing. Particularly, the mulches, the term mulch just means a surface covering to help suppress weeds, ultimately, and it does also hold a bit of moisture, but if it's made of compost, it replicates the forest litter. It sort of reminds the plants, oh yeah, I remember this. This is what started it all. My ancestors used to have compost. And so the compost on the surface is one of the key things, and it needs to be chunky. If it's too fine, it doesn't replicate that. Like when we saw the picture in nature, it's just kind of as rough, and I always try to emulate nature if I can. So I kind of like more oxygen in it. But it helps guard against soil erosion, and as a mulch, it will help suppress weeds as well. And of course, surface mulches suppress weed germination by blocking light. And that's the key thing. So you can take a piece of fabric and just throw it on the ground, and that will suppress weeds because it blocks the light out. And nothing will grow on top of it because there's nothing to grow on that weed. You know, well, some weeds are pretty tough, but you know, on a sheet of fabric, they won't grow on that. If you put rocks on top of that fabric, well, now you're starting to get anchoring points for seeds, and the seeds can get between the rocks and they can be protected, kept moist, and they can germinate and grow in there sometimes. But with compost, you don't use fabric, you just put it right in touch with the earth the way it was designed to be. So that's where the worms can come up and feed on it and add oxygenation. So I always find when I'm putting my compost mulch in, I'm actually just feeding the worms. You know, I can't help but to think of them. So you come into a garden and there's hardly any worms in there, but you clean it up and you make the plants look good and you do some divisions and you make it tidy, and then you add some of this beautiful compost in there, right? You put the compost all around, it looks nice like that, you know, nice and black colored. And then you just leave it and walk away. And you come back from time to time, and there's the occasional weed here or there. Some weeds are pretty tough, but they're pretty easy to weed when you have a nice layer of compost. The perfect layer of mulch is about 2.5 to 3 inches thick and doesn't actually touch the plant. It just kind of goes between the plants. That seems to be the best recipe. But you get a weed, it comes out really easy. But those worms are working, and you come back the next year and you might have had a couple hundred worms in there this year. Well, next year you've got a couple thousand. The next year you've got 100,000 worms. Like, it's unbelievable how they multiply, and they love to eat the compost off the surface. A lot of people wonder what worms do, but if you ever do a time-lapse film, because I've done them, it's the coolest thing. It's just to film your vegetable garden with a time-lapse camera for about 3 or 4 days. And you'll see what happens is that all day long, nothing happens. And as soon as it gets dark out, the worms come up. And they all come up onto the surface, just thousands of them, all different species, big ones, small ones, all kinds. And they roam around all over the surface and pick up all the scraps, and they cut down little plants, and they eat pieces of grass, and they're vegetarians, right? They'll eat a leaf. And I saw this one worm in one of my time-lapse films, and I swear the worm was over 1 foot long. It was a big dew worm. It grabbed a banana peel that was from the compost, and it tried to drag it down its hole. Like a banana peel. I couldn't believe it. It actually scared me a little bit, you know, because I thought, is that a snake or what is that? But it was just a big old dew worm, I guess. But anyway, it was pretty cool. I really learned a lot just from that one video, because, you know, that's what worms do. Go ahead.
Ken, I just wanted to say, the banana leaf, they love in my garden the iris leaves.
Iris leaves.
They're quite wide, and I was pulling the brush out today, and they're down deep. They could take a piece of their iris leaf.
Yeah.
The thing looks like it's just laying there, but it's stuck in the ground. You feel it.
Yeah, isn't that wonderful? So iris leaves are really great, apparently. And I know I've got lots of irises, and it all gets composted. It all goes into the system, but man, they are sure good.
What about this flax? Do you have flax problems with the moisture?
From time to time we have slug problems, and that just happens due to weather conditions more than anything, you know, or when you get, we've had some pretty rainy springs in the last couple of springs, and it's been unusual, so the slug populations are up, you know, but you know, I can't say much about the weather, but it's just weird, you know.
Anything which can prevent it in the mulch or something?
I haven't really had problems with it in the mulch with the slugs, but they will get onto plants.
Yeah.
And I found that mulches actually are a little difficult for slugs to crawl over. So, you know, if it's kind of coarse and chunky. Yeah, well, those things can definitely work too. Yeah, eggshells. And there was a few other things I heard people putting up strips of copper and all kinds of things, you know, copper tape around the perimeter of their veggie bins and things. But I think you know, the thing I do is in August, I always think that August is a big month for slugs. Slugs lay the predominant amount of their eggs through the month of August, and especially early August. And so at the end of August, the slugs are tiny. They're small, and there's lots of them. Those are the babies for next year. And so I always find that if I'm going to do slug control of any kind, which I don't usually, but you can use, you know, like safer slug pellets, and it really works well on the little ones. So again, mid to end of August is good timing, and if you can kind of put a little bit here and there, it reduces the population for the next year. And then anytime you're digging around underneath, you know, rocks and sticks and things, you sometimes find those clusters of those clear eggs. And you know, those are usually slug eggs, so I just put them out in the open where they'll die. That really works. So the key with this is that the compost, it suppresses light. So remember that seeds are really smart, and they know, especially the tiny ones, they know, hey, if I'm buried, I could be like 3 feet deep. And they're so tiny, they only have this little tiny bit of food to get up to where the light is. So they're not stupid. They're not going to germinate when they're a foot deep, right? They're going to wait till they see the light. So they wait for an animal to dig them up or something, and then the seed pops up on the surface, bam, it germinates. It's got moisture, warmth, and light, it grows. So those are the key ingredients that we know with a lot of seeds, not all seeds, but a good chunk of seeds germinate. They need to have light as well as moisture and warmth. And so mulches block out that light, and that's our tool that we use. Perennial weeds that have big strong roots and things, we're never going to get control, but they're sure a lot easier to pull when they get in the compost. So that's basically the general rule there. So there's lots of different types of mulches that we see. And I don't know, maybe somebody, picture's a little blurry up there, but it's pretty good, but people might recognize this from one of the garden tours in the past. And I think those are master gardeners down there talking away. I think that's, I can't remember her name. So surface coverings that help to prevent the weed growth, and they may also feed the soil and mimic forest litter. So that means they may or they may not. So if they're rock, they're not gonna help. You know, they look good, they're pretty low maintenance. You know, they can look nice, but they're not part of that ecosystem, right? The ecosystem is always based around composted products. So we have rock, bark, compost itself, which is more like Ogogrow type product. Cardboard, which people use as a mulch to suppress weeds. It actually works pretty good. You can put down cardboard, put mulch on top of that. Fabric is still a mulch. It's called a fabric mulch. Raw wood is used. Remember that any raw wood products, they're so hungry for nitrogen. The bacteria want to consume it so badly, but they need lots and lots of nitrogen to consume it, so they can't consume it. But if you put it on the ground, they'll literally rob the nitrogen from the ground to eat that wood. It's just a true fact that raw wood products steal nitrogen. So if you want to prevent plant growth, use raw wood. Works really well, but don't put it on your plants that you want to grow, because it will steal their nitrogen. We had extensive tests where we grew probably about 25,000 plants, and we grew big blocks of 200 to 300 of each different species. And then out of each block of 250, we would cover the surface of the soil with a sort of a wood shavings product. And then we had a whole bunch of different wood products we could try. But it was unbelievable. The plants that were not mulched were beautiful and green and happy with almost no fertilizer. And then the plants that had the wood mulch were just about dead, and they were yellow and stunted. And we thought, well, it's just a nitrogen deficiency. So let's start putting fertilizer on these and see if we can turn it around. Because we were trying to suppress weed growth, and it definitely suppressed the weed growth. So we started putting the nitrogen on. We would put like double the amount we would normally put on each plant. Didn't do anything. So we doubled that amount, didn't do anything. And then we doubled that amount, and it started to turn them green, just barely. And so, you know, we realized it was a great learning procedure, and it was done so, you know, so that we could get away from using chemicals to suppress weed growth in containers. But we had to do a pretty big scale test to try different types of wood products. So anyway, it was a really good learning thing. So rubber is used a lot in landscaping, surprisingly, as they're recycled tires and things, but I don't recommend it. They leach chemicals into the ground, and it's not really a good thing. So how to get started, you know, where to locate your bin. A lot of us already know this. You know, we've had compost before, so we know that it does have a bit of an odor at times. And, you know, it's one of those things that you have to think a little bit about where you put it, and you just try to put it out back, and if you really hate the neighbor, you put it right close to their window, you know. But anyway, yeah, location is important, but you know, how big should it be is a question. And everybody know John Alcock from the Sunshine Farms? Yeah, like he taught me years ago, you got to have a big pile. The bigger the pile, the better it composts. And he always said, you know, the minimum size for a compost heap is about 5 feet by 5 feet. That would be the perfect size, and bigger, but not smaller than that. So I took that to heart, and every time I build a compost pile, I just try to get it as big as I can for the area that I have, and go with that. Most people build them about 3 feet by 3 foot size for a pile, maybe sometimes a bit bigger. So, and you know, to be able to maintain the pile is one of the other key things. So compost location, odors can be a problem. We want to avoid soggy conditions. Compost may leak a liquid, and that's something you want to keep. That would be your humic acid. But how do you keep it, right? It's kind of hard. But some people have trays underneath, you know, that take the water. I built a tray. I built a big, like it's like a tank, and I put all my compost in it. And then when water just trickles through it slowly, and it drips out a drain at the bottom into a thing, I can scoop the compost juice out. I swear it's pure humic acid. It's just a beautiful thing. So. So usually is located near the garden, but not too close to sitting areas or windows. And a nice level spot is good, but just not in a spot where it's going to get baked by the sun all day. It's funny, if you lived in Vancouver, you'd want to put it in a sunny spot. But when you live out here, you probably want to put it in a part shady spot, because the thing just dries out so fast. Remember, we want to try to get to that 30%, you know, 30 to 50% moisture at all times in that compost pile. So if you feel it and it's kind of crunchy, you got to add some water to it. So here's some compost piles, and these are sort of minimum sizes, but this gentleman's just got multiple different types of compost piles, and straw and hay and all kinds of things on the go. There's some horse manure there. You have to be a little careful with horse manure because there's chemicals in it sometimes. Some of you might know that horses are expensive to deal with at veterinary clinics. So if they eat any of the noxious weeds, they got a trip to the vet. So most people who have horses always put down chemicals to prevent the noxious weeds, which go right through the horse. Doesn't cause the horse any problem, but it does end up in the manure. So just as a heads up, I'm a little cautious about that. So the maintenance of compost, you can see these are windrows. This would be sort of representative to what they would do at the landfill here, but any place that has compost as a byproduct should put it in windrows like this, and they just flip it over and keep turning it. Here they actually have pipes that they blow air into it, so it doesn't have to be moved around as much. And they have thermometers, and they keep it at the optimum temperature at all the time, so they just go along and check it, and they make sure the temperature's up or down. If it goes down too much, maybe they need to aerate it, or maybe they need to add some water to it. So they check a moisture test, and they keep it just optimum, and it's unbelievable how fast they can produce a beautiful compost product. Often it's just a couple of months. They can turn it around, so really nice thing. So different compost systems. You'll see some of these ones like in the upper left-hand corner there, that's more like one you get from the municipalities and whatnot, and they're okay. They're kind of a passive system. They're not really an active system, right? No, they're usually.
I had a problem with mice.
Yes.
Because they said you should put some foundation down, but if you put a foundation, you don't get the worms.
Yeah.
So is wire good enough?
Yeah, I would, if I had a choice, I would rather just have a pile, or I'd have a, you know, piece of fencing or chicken wire around it. You still get the mice. There's not much you can do about that. But what I find with these is you get a lot of anaerobic stuff happening, so it starts to stink. You know, that sewer smell that you get from compost, like that's anaerobic bacteria. So we want aerobic bacteria That's when you turn it and you add oxygen in, it just heats it up and it doesn't smell bad.
If you use the plastic bins, should you put a foundation like the wiring before you get all the elements like rats, nests?
Yeah, adding wiring around these things is not a bad idea. You can use a 1/2-inch mesh. Remember that when you go to ask for it at the hardware stores, they won't know what you mean, even if you know the right name of it. But it's called hardware cloth. No, it won't. They won't know it. You have to ask for hardware cloth. So hardware cloth is a material that is available in 16th inch, 1/8 inch, 1/4 inch, 3/8 inch, 3/4 inch, and sometimes even up to 1 inch. But sort of a 1/2 inch or smaller is probably better, and that'll help keep the rodents out.
But still will get the worms in.
Yeah, the skinny ones, I guess. Maybe not that big one that was in my garden. I don't know, that was pretty big. But yeah, so that would be good. That's actually is a good idea. You can consider that in any of the types of situations. So again, we have the sort of the general compost bin that you'll see. Then you'll see the compost heap, which we've talked about. It's really the way compost is designed, but really you need to almost have a little tractor or something to turn it, or a young guy with a strong back. And then the turning and tumbling types are really great. They just turn it so fast. They turn it into compost so quick that you got to use it before it's gone. Because remember what I was saying about how my pile, by the time I got into my 9th bin, there was literally nothing left. And if you have one of these, it can break stuff down so quick, like a month or two, and it's beautiful. But you definitely need to have multiple bins, is what I found. So I think the one on the lower left has 2 sides to it. One is fresh and one is old. So then you'd have some usable compost. So the 3-bin system in the middle and the bottom, actually the 2 leftover pictures there are both, that's sort of what I would call a typical compost bin. They're about 3, each bin is about 3 feet by 3 feet, and they're put side by side. It's a 3-bin system. So again, you fill the first bin up. Once it's full, you move it into the second bin. So then you start filling the first bin again. When the first bin gets full, you move the second bin into the third, the first into the second, and then you start filling the first again. By the time you get the first one filled, the third one's ready to use. And then that's the system. So you're always putting your fresh in the first, your medium breaking down in the middle, and then at the end, it's pretty much usable. You can still turn it a bit depending on, you can just tell if it needs a bit more, but that works really well. So I like the 3-bin system. So compost tea is something that's interesting, and you hear a lot of people talking about it, at least I do. I always hear people talking about compost tea. And basically what they're doing is taking water and they're supercharging it with oxygen bubbles, so air, and they add compost to it. So some people put it in a big cheesecloth and let it soak in there. Some people just dump it right in. There's a whole number of different products you can buy that are supposed to help to stimulate your compost tea production. So you can buy these little bags of things and put it in, but you don't really have to do that because the compost has it all in it already. So compost is super loaded with all kinds of life. It's got just tons of microbes and bacteria and fungus. It's got all kinds of stuff in there. Some of it is bad, but the majority of it is good. And so what happens is when you put it in this situation with the water, it will very quickly die if you don't aerate it. You've got to have lots of oxygen. So with these systems, that's what they do is they just add tons of aeration and bubbling to it. And so it only takes about 24 hours, and you might put in there, say, maybe 150 billion bacteria, which is about probably what you would have in a small bag of compost. You put it in, and then just over a very short period of time, literally 24 hours, that will multiply by often 100 times. So it multiplies. So then what you end up with is this soup that's full of all this life. There's a little bit of organic acid in there too, but it's predominantly water. But now you've got this soup. So what do you do with it? So you spray it right on top of the plants from top to bottom. You water the plants with it. You do all of the above. They're finding they're getting really good control of fungus diseases with compost tea, like powdery mildew. Like when you spray a plant down with compost tea, it's just loaded with life. It's got billions and billions of bacteria and fungus and stuff in it. So it coats the whole plant. And then within just a matter of minutes, it's starting to live, and it's moving around on the plant, and it covers the plant from top to bottom. The plants tend to take the nutrients right out of that juice as well. But what really happens is that when the diseases try to move in, they've got nowhere to live because it's already full. Every space is filled. There's no place for fungus to grow. So it's literally just a displacement program. So when you do apply these things, it works fabulous, and there's a lot of really cool new ideas. And again, John's our man.
Don't you dilute your compost tea before you put it in the garden?
No, it doesn't have to be diluted. You can just use it straight. Some people do dilute it, depending if they're putting it through a sprayer of some sort sometimes. It just needs to be filtered well because it's full of all kinds of little bits. But you just want the water, and you want it to be like freshly bubbled. Take it and use it within a short period of time. If you just let it sit, it'll all die. The anaerobic bacteria will take over, and then it won't be good. So other bits on composting. So other things. Compost additives are usually calcium nitrate, which help the compost to activate, but are usually but are usually not necessary to add just the green. I don't know if I said that right. But the whole idea there is that the nitrogen, when you buy those composting products, you buy them and it's called, I don't know, I can't even remember one of the names of them, but it's a powder that you mix. Do you remember?
Can you close it? We have to
Yep.
go to here by 9 o'clock.
We only have one slide left, I think. We're right on time. So yeah, so anyway, the green is the nitrogen, so you can add more green, and that's what'll feed it. So the key to active composting is regular activity with oxygen. Turn your pile every day or two, and use a system that makes sense, that's easy to access and turn. 3-bin systems seem to work, and large systems are normally piles or heaps that need to be turned with a tractor. So I'll just skip over that one. So the earth is a living organism. 1 cubic centimeter of garden soil will have about 4 billion bacteria in it. So it's literally a living little thing. And if you took the human body and divided it into individual cells, only 1/5 of them would be human. That's an interesting little tidbit. So when things die, they are returned to the earth through decomposition, sometimes slow and sometimes fast. And feed your soil, and it will feed your plants.